welcome back. Today we're going to do the valves of my 2004 Suzuki Marauder, also known as the GZ250. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any videos like this and much more. Let's get started. Alright, so I got most of my tools all collected that I'm going to need. So the first thing I'm going to do is take the seat off. And then once the seat's off, I can start taking the tank off. So get that loosened. They're just 10mm bolts. I'm just gonna set that there, and it's easy to remember how it goes back on. As you can see, there's a slant on it, so the slant is pointing towards the back so the seat slips in easier. That's a little way to remember how it goes. You also want to, when you do your valves, you want to do it with the engine cold, otherwise they won't set properly. And then you need to take the gas line off the tank. I already went ahead and removed the clip so it'll come off easier. And then there's a vacuum line on the back that allows the fuel to run, and you got to pull that as well. Once you have that, once you have the seat clamp off and your two lines, the tank will just slip right off. And then I always just set it on one of these chairs here. They seem to hold tanks really well. Even with my other bike, it always just seems to work quite nicely. So now our motors are exposed. And then we're going to take the chrome side covers off so we have full access to the top end of the motor. And I also like to, before I touch the valves, I like to do a compression test just to see what the compression is before I start and then the finish compression. And these are just number 4 Allen key. Now that we got the side covers off, we're going to go ahead and remove the spark plug. I'm just going to use the kit that comes with it. Just pull the plug wire off. Not a bad idea if there's a lot of dirt around the spark plug to take some compressed air and blow it out of the way so nothing falls into the cylinder. Looking at the plug, it's definitely running pretty lean. It's on the white side. So I'll have to see if I can make it run a little bit richer. Now I'm going to get my compression tester out. That's what I have for a tester. It works pretty good actually, I like it. And it comes with 2 different fittings too, so you always have the right adapter for the motor. So I find the easiest way is to screw this onto here and then use that to kind of spin it because it's down so far it's hard to get your fingers in to really hold it. And then we grab our gauge. And it just slips right on. And then when you do your compression test, you want to do it with your throttle wide open. So you turn it all the way and then roll it over. That's about 90 psi. We'll do it a couple times just to verify it. That's 90. With this bike you have to hold the clutch in and roll the throttle, so it's hard to hold the gauge so you can see it on camera. But it was at 90 psi, so I'm going to write that down in my little book so I don't forget what my starting pressure was. And that'll give us a good baseline so we know how much we've improved it once we're done. Or if it gets worse, then we know we did something terribly wrong. So I'm going to take this back out now. And then I'm going to put the spark plug back in. Just to make sure no dirt or anything gets into the cylinder. Alright, now I'm going to come over to the left side of the motor, and there's two plugs you have to pull out. You gotta go pull this big center one out so you can rotate the motor on the crank, and then you gotta pull this little plug out here on the top just so you can see the timing marks. So there'll be timing marks on the motor. So you spin it so you're at top dead center of the compression stroke, and you'll verify that to make sure 100%. You'll have the valve covers off so you can see them. If these ever give you trouble taking them out, just take a chisel and put it right on there and hammer in the direction you need to go to get it off, and that will work almost all the time. And for that plug, it was 17 millimeter to get the plug out. And then your crank is a 22 millimeter, so you can get on the crank to spin it. And you want to make sure you have no dirt or anything on your sockets too, because you don't want that getting inside your motor and into your oil. So now that we have these prepped and ready, we're going to take our valve covers off. Our valve covers are just a 10 millimeter wrench. Alright, so there's the intake and exhaust off. One thing with this motor, it's a 4-valve motor. It has 2 intake valves and 2 exhaust valves. So you got to make sure you set all of them. And you want the 2 intakes to be as close as possible to each other, and same with the exhaust. Otherwise, one side of the cylinder will be moving more air than the other, and it just won't quite be balanced.
Now with those off, we're able to line up there'll be a T with a line, and then there's a marking on the block. So we're actually lined up on there, but we're not sure if it's compression stroke or not yet.
So with our socket in, with the plug out, or with the plug loose, you can turn it by hand. But looking in, you can see the T with the line, and then you see if it goes back in focus there, you can see the line on the case. So you want to line those 2 lines up, just like so. But you want to make sure that you're on the compression stroke. So you'll know that because the valves in here, these are the exhaust, and then these are the intake on this side of the motor where the carb is. When you spin that around, you'll be able to see the valves work. So I'm just going to spin it. And so right now the exhaust valves are open, and then you're coming back around. They're coming up, and that line should be coming around pretty soon. Oh, just went by. Right there. And all the valves are closed. So now we're able to get in there with our feeler gauges and start checking specs. Alright, so specs for these valves. The intake valves are 0.03 to 0.08 millimeter for the intake, and the exhaust are 0.08 to 0.13 millimeter, and that's for the exhaust. So I slip the intake valve cover back on quickly, just because I want to get these wires moved out of the way so I can get in easier with my feeler gauge. So I'll just take the factory tie wraps off, and then I'm able to move the wires a little bit because it's pretty tight getting in there. It gives you a little bit more room if you have them loose. You can push them out of the way. You can even go as far as getting some of these little connectors undone, just to give a little more room. We'll grab our feeler gauges. At these small tolerances, it's a little bit tricky because the feeler gauge is so floppy. So the intake are feeling pretty good actually. Now I'll check the exhaust. Alright, so when I was editing this video, I realized that I didn't show very well how I'm actually checking the valves. So I'm going to try to demonstrate it on my workbench here, just using 2 carriage bolts. So this carriage bolt here we're going to use to simulate the top end of the valve, and I'm going to use this carriage bolt to simulate the adjuster on the rocker arm. So basically all we're doing is there's a gap there. You're going to be taking your feeler gauge and getting it into that gap and making sure it's at the right distance. And then where my hand is, that's kind of like the nut. There'd be a nut on there that you'd put your wrench on, and then you have your little tool here that fits on the square end of the top of your valve adjuster, and it would just go in like that, and you would turn it one way or the other to either raise up, making a bigger gap between your top of your valve and your rocker arm, or a smaller gap. So that's basically all we're doing. You have your right size feeler gauge and you're putting it in, and there should be just a little bit of resistance. If it's too tight and you can't get it in, then you got to raise it up until you're able to get it in. And if there's too much of a gap and it's way too sloppy, you need to lower it down to get that proper gap. Without the proper gap, either your valves be opening too soon or too late, and it's staying open longer, or closing too fast. The motor's not breathing the way it wants to breathe. So I'm hoping that gives a little clarification on what I'm actually checking when I'm going in there with the feeler gauges, since I didn't show it that great on the when I was actually doing it. So hopefully this helps keep things a little bit clearer, and let's carry on. Alright, the valves look pretty good, so I'm not going to adjust them. I'm going to show how you would adjust them. So you can buy the tool right from Suzuki. It's just a number 2 Robertson. Really, so I've seen guys use red Robertson screws and cork and that kind of stuff. And then on the top of your valve stem, there's a little nut there, and then a Robertson head, or I guess an inverted Robertson head. So you would put your wrench onto that little nut, and then you would slip your tool on to there. Then you break that nut free, and then you spin it one way or the other way to either raise or lower the valve, snug it up, and then you check it, and then rotate the motor around a couple times, and then double check it again to make sure it doesn't move out of where you set it from. So I'm going to start putting my valve covers back on and closing up the side of the motor, and then I'm going to go around and torque all the head bolts just to see if things came a little bit loose, and if I can boost my compression a little bit. So I was hoping to get up back in the around 110, 120 psi would make me a lot happier. So the head bolt torque specs for the 10 millimeter bolts, they're 38 Newton meters, which is 27.5 foot-pounds. And if you need to convert that to inch-pounds, you just multiply by 12. And then the 6 millimeter bolts are 10 Newton meters, or 7 foot-pounds. So we'll start getting the covers on. I'm going to start with the intake. It doesn't matter which ones you start with. And when you have the valve covers off, it's a good time to inspect the gasket that goes all the way around it. Because if that rubber gasket gets bad, it'll end up leaking oil over your motor all the time. You'll smell oil. So it'd be a good time to change it if it is bad. These ones look pretty good, so I'm just going to reuse them. Now I'll put the You don't want to go too tight, otherwise it's really hard to get off. I just snug it up, and then you can get the inspection plug back in. So I went around and snugged everything up. There's this one bolt right here. Let me get my focus on it. And it's, I've had issues with it before coming loose. Basically right after it's out of warranty. And the threads are stripped inside the jug itself. So even when you try to get it on, it doesn't go on. So that's probably where I'm losing a lot of my compression, unfortunately. And to fix that, you gotta rip the whole top end apart and probably have to re-tap the threads inside the jug. So we'll see if we gained any compression from snugging everything else up. Hopefully we do. But that's probably where my big loss of compression is coming from. Yeah, we gained a little bit, about 95. Not nearly as high as I'd like it. So I'm going to start throwing everything back together. I'm going to give the spark plug a quick clean before I put it in. And then I'll put that back in. I'll start getting everything closed up. Alright, I'm slipping the spark plug back in. Then I'm going to start closing everything up. And I'll slip the plug wire back on. Make sure it engages all the way. And then we can get our little chrome covers on. Now we're going to slip the tank on. There's these two pucks on each side of the frame. And then on the tank, there is two pockets that those fit into. You just bring it over, just jiggle it in place. And then you're ready to start putting these on. Alright, all we have left to do is get the seat on. I want to fire the bike up first, make sure it starts and runs okay. Well, that concludes our video on how to check the valves on a Suzuki Marauder 250. I hope it was helpful. Don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.